today is becoming a more frightening place. And as Al Gore famously said about the environment, we are the enemy, just as we have only ourselves as allies. There is overpopulation on the planet. Poverty is widespread. Pollution is getting worse. Global warming is becoming a serious threat. And so is deforestation, which is causing biodiversity loss.
Because over the past couple of hundred years, as we got industrialized, we've started using more and more resources which are non-renewable, and when they're gone, they're gone.
The main culprits of this destruction come from two areas. First, big business doing all it can to maximize profits. And second, from humans who refuse to make greener choices about the way they live. The human population is growing by 77 million per year. They consume both goods and services in an unsustainable way. People need food in order to survive. This includes dietary fats and oils, which are part of everyone's staple diet. People also want to consume a whole range of products. Some are necessities, such as food and water, while some are luxuries, such as cars, holidays, or fast food. All these goods and services have to be produced somehow. And therefore, a lot of energy is required. In contrast, a huge portion of the planet lives in terrible poverty. And these people have the right to improve their standard of living. So the challenge is to make all of this possible without destroying the only environment we will ever have. The problem is that humans think they can act above the laws of nature. This is alarming, because these activities have direct ecological consequences. Unlike economic crises, however, there is no central bank against which people can borrow to bail themselves out. An ecological debt means environmental bankruptcy, and perhaps extinction. This debt is now due. So in order to make the right ecological or green decisions, what do people have to do? Well, one area is to explore what crops to farm that are high-yielding and also not too damaging to the environment. One crop that falls into the edible oils and fats category and can also be used as a biofuel is palm oil. However, NGOs, especially from the West, paint a very negative picture of the palm oil industry.
The companies or even the natives themselves, they clear fell and plant all these oil palm all the way to the river banks, okay? And that's not good.
They're not saying they care about the forest, they're not saying they care about the environment, they're not saying they care about the climate.
Palm oil is saving the world with a resource that is sustainable and providing a food source for a world that is deficient or having a shortage in this type of commodity.
This industry is here, it has to be supported, and if we can do it in a sensible way, that will be good for all.
What impact has palm oil had on the planet? And who is to be trusted on whether this is a good or a bad crop, both in terms of biodiversity as a food source and as a possible biofuel? Before one can answer any of these questions, it is important to know where oil palms come from, how palm oil is produced, and what it is used for. The oil palm is a native of Western Central Africa. In this part of the world, red crude palm oil has been used in cooking for thousands of years. In the beginning, West Africa provided Europe with all the palm oil it needed. However, During the Industrial Revolution, Europeans discovered that it worked as a good machine lubricant, long before learning about its food potential. As demand grew rapidly, the industrial production of palm oil became necessary. It was back in the mid to late 1800s that oil palm seeds were brought to modern-day Indonesia by the Dutch, and later on the French and Belgians imported it to the Malay Peninsula. Oil palms were initially grown as an ornamental plant by the European settlers. But as demand for palm oil rose across the world in the early part of the 20th century, it was then planted on a commercial basis throughout Southeast Asia, but mainly in Malaysia and Indonesia. It is clear that the cultivation of oil palms over the last century has brought an enormous rise in wealth, both to the respective countries as a whole and to the rural poor in particular. In Malaysia, for example, the Felder scheme was established in the late 1950s, and the incomes of workers in the palm oil industry are now at least 3 times higher than the national poverty level. Today, these people are able to afford proper housing, feed their families comfortably, and can now send their children to schools and universities, opportunities which the previous generations were unable to enjoy.
One of the main sources of income for Indonesia is from its agricultural land. If you take away their ability to use that land for the benefit of its people, you can be accused of going too far.
Of course, the rich have gotten richer from this boom, and income redistribution could be better. But it is important to note that without this agricultural industry, the rural poor in Southeast Asia would not have seen their living standards improve as much as they have today. Over the years, the cultivation of oil palms has significantly increased across the region as demand has gone up. And today, it dominates the other major cash crops like rubber and cocoa. About 2/3 of palm oil produced today comes from major plantation companies such as Sime Darby and IOI, whilst the remaining third is still grown by small-scale farmers. Nevertheless, the cultivation process involved in establishing a plantation is the same. While the seedlings are germinating, the land is prepared. And then young palms have to be transplanted from the nursery to the plantation. After about 3 years of growth, the harvesting can begin, and this will continue for about 25 years. In other words, oil palms are perennial. This means they do not have to be harvested and replanted every year, unlike annual crops.
If something is sustainable, then you can just keep on getting it and keep on getting it. Palm oil fits into that category because palm oil is something that you can keep sowing palm seeds, growing palm trees, and harvesting palm oil.
Another important factor to consider is that annual crops such as soy, rapeseed, and sunflower, for example, are potentially far more damaging to the soil and create far more wind and water erosion than do perennial plants like oil palms. So what oils are actually extracted from the oil palm? The oil palm is unique as it creates 2 different oils. First, there is the palm oil that comes from the flesh of the fruit. And second, the palm kernel oil, which comes from the kernel that is inside the seed of the fruit. The ripe fruit bunches are picked and sent to the mill all year round. Each bunch from a mature tree weighs roughly 20 kilograms and contains on average 1,500 date-sized fruitlets. These fruits are steam cooked and then pressed to extract crude palm oil. The kernels, or the seeds, which are really hard, are crushed in a separate process and then pressed to extract the palm kernel oil. From the mill, the crude palm oil is sent to a refinery. Here it can be further processed to make industrial and occasionally pharmaceutical products. or it can be bottled as cooking oil and ultimately exported to overseas markets. This leads on to the next important question. Is palm oil actually good for you? Many people believe it's poisonous and have no idea how much of it they actually consume on a daily basis.
It is a vital and critical component of food that you must have. That's why the World Health Organization recommends an optimum level that you should use or take oil to the tune of making up 30% of your calories or energy that you consume every day.
In the competitive and corporate world of today, palm oil has been the subject of a lot of negative publicity and propaganda surrounding its health qualities and importance as a food source. No one disputes that edible oils and fats are an essential part of the human diet. But what about their cholesterol levels? The consumption of cholesterol has become a dirty word in today's society, yet it is often misunderstood. When people take in cholesterol, it is mainly from animal sources such as chicken, beef and so on, while plant foods, which include oils and fats, are mostly cholesterol-free. Unfortunately, humans are not very good at absorbing cholesterol as part of their diets. And on top of this, cholesterol is produced in the liver and circulates in the blood. Blood cholesterol levels can be split into two groups, the bad cholesterol, LDL, and the good cholesterol, HDL. It's the balancing of the good versus the bad cholesterols that reduces the risk of heart disease. Oils and fats are mainly composed of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fatty acids. And generally, these saturates increase blood cholesterol levels in the body. Fortunately, palm oil has a balanced fatty acid composition, and extensive research proves it has a neutral effect on blood cholesterol. Moreover, it does not contain trans fatty acids, which are being phased out globally, as they are the real culprits and represent increased risk, not only for heart disease, but also obesity and the metabolic syndrome, which can include diabetes. It is widely believed that there are only two commercially available fruit oils today, olive oil and palm oil.
Palm oil is one of the best oils to consume. It's as good as olive oil based on studies done around the world. And olive oil is known to be a very good oil, part of the Mediterranean diet that keep people healthy.
So is palm oil good from a health point of view? Clearly, the answer has to be yes. Another vital question is how important is palm oil as a food source? Worldwide, humans consume about 160 million tons of vegetable oils and fats per year, of which palm oil makes up roughly a quarter, and therefore it can be found in thousands of products. On today's supermarket shelves, palm oil can be found in roughly 1 out of every 10 products. It is present in everything from ice cream to margarines, bakery products, breads, biscuits, chocolate and frozen foods, to soaps, lubricants and cosmetics. However, not all these products specifically list palm oil as an ingredient, as palm oil, along with its competitors, is often simply referred to as vegetable oil. What would happen without palm oil in our diet? It is high in energy and relatively cheap, and without it, all people, especially the poor, would be undernourished. One of the most critical issues facing the oil palm industry is the alarming rate of deforestation in Southeast Asia, which is home to many unique species of animals and some of the oldest rainforests in the world. With good reason, the prominent American scientist and author Jared Diamond has called the invention of agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race. Even the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations agrees with this. In a 1998 report, it claimed that modern agriculture has brought increases in food production, but at a high environmental cost. The production and distribution of food is a major cause of climate change. In Europe, for example, the number of characteristic species has been reduced to about 45% of its level compared to 150 years ago. Worldwide, more than 10% of all vertebrates, which include fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals, are now threatened with extinction. The major problem confronting oil palms is that they grow best where tropical rainforests also grow, and this happens to be in one of the most biologically rich regions of the planet. These rainforests, which are home to several iconic species, are being destroyed, and in the public eye, this is a major problem for the oil palm industry.
Greenpeace put Indonesia in the Guinness Book of Records, the country with the faster rate deforestation in the world. The rate of deforestation what we are using is the 1.8 million hectare per year. And that's similar, more or less similar with the 6 football field per minute.
What is even more worrying is that these animals are losing their habitat at an alarming rate. In the last 100 years, more than 90% of the tigers, Asian rhinos and orangutan have disappeared. It is obvious that current land use practices do not always conform to sustainability and eco-friendly guidelines, partly because these guidelines are not mandatory or are poorly enforced. For example, wildlife corridors are not properly established and riverbanks are not protected adequately. Even today, sensitive peatlands are still cleared to make way for plantations. This is terrible for the environment because peatland, once drained, releases huge amounts of methane, an even more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. In some parts of the world, notably South America and Southeast Asia, virgin rainforest is still being cleared on a very large scale. Some NGOs claim that after the extremely valuable timber is removed, the remaining cleared forest is normally burnt, as it's the cheapest option, and this in turn releases massive amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. These practices still continue unabated today and go largely unchecked on the islands of Borneo and Sumatra.
So they are allowed to develop shallow peat for agriculture purposes and planting crops that can grow on peat. And this has been, the choice has been pineapple, even rubber to a certain extent, and oil palm, all can grow on peat, provided that they are shallow peat and allowed to be converted to agriculture.
20% of greenhouse gases is coming from the deforestation. Now the current data of the annual greenhouse gases is 15 billion tons. Only from peatland is 1.8 billion per year.
But there are lands which may not be good for oil palm plantation. I'm talking about peat swamp forest. I don't think we should plan on those things.
To be impartial, it has to be said that biodiversity has been reduced all over the planet, not just in oil palm plantations. Wheat, maize, soy, rape and other grain fields have also destroyed natural ecosystems. But unfortunately, oil palm plantations grow best in the same regions where tropical rainforests are also found. Surprisingly, there is little ecological criticism of the massive tulip, lavender, rose and other flower fields in Europe, which wiped out what was there before them, and even worse, to make way for non-food crops. From the perspective of third world countries, it rather looks like the developed nations are taking a big brother approach again. Having destroyed their own environment to further their development, they are now saying to the poorer countries, hold on, don't develop, preserve your rainforests because it's important to the world.
Is any of the finger wagging from one country or another, is it going to be partly politically motivated? I can't believe that there's no politics in this process whatsoever. There has to be. There's a lot of money involved, there's a lot of corporate interests involved, so inevitably you're going to get the stuff that human beings do when there's a lot of interests at stake. All I can say is that the palm oil in terms of basic science has a lot to be said for it.
So this is where with all the campaigns and negative publicity focused or directed at palm, the palm oil continues to be in big demand because we are fulfilling a vital need of the other countries in supplementing their shortages.
The ecological issues surrounding the oil palm industry are particularly topical, as palm oil is a vital revenue earner for the nations of Southeast Asia, and it has improved the well-being of thousands of rural people. However, the vital question is at what ecological cost to the planet? And is there a solution to make all parties agree on the way forward? As mentioned earlier, palm oil can also be used as a biodiesel. Although the biofuel industry is still relatively new and research is ongoing, people will require other sources of fuel as the planet's demand for energy is enormous.
When talking about palm oil as a fuel, there's several big advantages to it as a fuel. If you compare it, first of all, with coal or oil even, coal and oil are non-renewable fuels. There's a certain number of tons of oil, there's a certain number of tons of coal under the ground. How much varies a little bit depending on how you make your estimates, but there's a certain amount, and when it's gone, it's gone.
While the human population has increased by about 50% in the last 50 years, energy consumption has more than doubled. And on top of that, 80 to 90% of the world's energy demands come from non-renewable fossil sources. And when these are burnt, they produce greenhouse gases. The petroleum industry, amongst others, has been doing its best to confuse people, all in the name of profit. According to a recent article in the New York Times, in order to win, all they had to do was cause enough confusion to blunt public concern and delay government action. One thing to make very clear, though, almost all scientists agree that the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has contributed significantly to global warming. Is there a solution to this? Maybe. Some governments and scientists want people to switch over to renewable and sustainable sources of energy, such as biofuels. One temporary answer could be biodiesel, which is a substitute for regular diesel and can also be used in a normal engine. What is the main difference between biodiesel and regular diesel? Biodiesel can reduce total carbon emissions drastically, but it depends upon how it is produced. This is best explained through two different scientific processes, known as carbon capture and carbon sequestration. Plants go through a process known as photosynthesis. They absorb carbon dioxide, split it up, and use the carbon to grow and produce, and then release oxygen back into the atmosphere for animals and humans to breathe. Whereas, when a plant dies and decomposes, or is even burnt, then most of the carbon it has managed to capture during its life is released back into the atmosphere. If, on the other hand, the plant is buried and eventually becomes coal, the carbon that it has captured is sequestered or stored underground. For millions of years, this sequestering process was left alone, until humans discovered that sequestered carbon was a convenient fuel, and therefore started to release large amounts of sequestered carbon into the atmosphere and increased global warming.
Biofuels, and palm oil in particularly, there's no limit to how much we can have. We can just keep harvesting it every year. Crude oil, you say how much is there in terms of millions of tons. Palm oil, you'd measure in terms of millions of tons per year. If you can keep harvesting it and growing and planting and harvesting, you can keep on the supply, really as long as there are people around.
One possible solution to control carbon emissions is to use the right kind of biofuels. This can be done by releasing mostly captured carbon rather than sequestered carbon. Another point to note is that biofuels have another big advantage. They contain no sulfur, so they produce less acidic and therefore cleaner exhaust gases than fossil fuels. This in turn reduces acid rain and pollution.
So the advantage on biodiesel is definitely that you have a very, very low sulfur content. And of course, this is as well then something which helps for the environment. The CO2 emission is exactly what the plant before took into the plant by growing, which then is being released by burning off.
It's hardly surprising then that biofuels have begun attracting champions from all walks of life. Both individuals and governments have become supporters of alternative energy, like biofuels.
As a fuel, it's a pretty good fuel. 39 megajoules per kilogram, its fuel value is good, it's very close to basic diesel. Most diesel engines will run on it. Power stations can be easily converted to it. It's got a good density. There's a slight problem in using it as a fuel in Northern Europe because basic palm oil, if it's not converted into biodiesel, will go a little bit thick and sometimes a little bit solid like margarine.
Biodiesel fuel we invested already since 2003, where we had a project together with a research company in India and a university in Germany on growing Jatropha, where actually we also used then 100% biodiesel produced from this Jatropha in our cars.
The European Union has stipulated that by 2020, 20% of all transport fuel must come from renewable energy sources. Is this a case of too little too late? Probably. And even biofuels have their critics too, as many opponents don't support these arguments that biofuels are really that beneficial to the planet.
And my opinion on biofuels from, say, corn. Corn is a great product to grow in North America because it's well known and it suits the climate. The big negative of ethanol, in converting corn into ethanol, is that it costs a lot of energy to make that barrel of ethanol as a fuel. So I would say there's a huge benefit to having the palm oil industry where the climate suits the industry best. And places where you can't grow it, yeah, I guess that might influence their opinion a little bit.
The food versus fuel debate is getting stronger, as a lot of people believe that diverting precious food commodities, such as palm oil, to manufacture biofuels is highly controversial. Their main argument is that a food crop ought not to be used to manufacture fuel or plastics, while there is massive undernourishment on the planet. Given that farmers around the world currently overproduce commodities like milk, and that there is enough grain to feed almost 1.5 times the world's current population, then why are there food shortages and people starving on the planet? Surely, poor food distribution is to blame, and not insufficient food production. Some people also argue that it is morally wrong to use food as a fuel. The problem here is that this argument fails to consider one massive reality. The amount of agricultural land on the planet is limited. Therefore, the key issue is what plants produce the most crops per hectare. Or in other words, what is their yield efficiency? The highest yielding crop, regardless of whether it produces an edible oil or not, is certainly the most productive, and also the most eco-friendly option. Another argument from critics is that using food as fuel will drive food prices up. This may well be so, but the situation is not that straightforward. Current technology allows companies to manufacture biodiesel, but at a higher price than that of producing regular diesel. So it is unlikely that in the near future, a significant portion of edible oils are going to be converted into biodiesel. If energy keeps being consumed at present levels, then yes, the price of many things will increase, as the planet needs fuel and energy to function, and people are simply not doing enough to reduce their needs for energy. One solution could be to tax biofuels appropriately, and this tax could then be used to subsidize food production and distribution. Then maybe food prices could be kept stable. There is no choice in this matter. From an ecological point of view, the world must explore what are the most efficient oil-bearing crops and what is their carbon capture. So how does oil palm compare to other oil-bearing crops? One of the first things to note is that oil palms are relatively big trees and therefore absorb a lot more carbon dioxide and release a lot more oxygen per hectare than do smaller oil-bearing crops. Over the course of 1 year, for example, 1 hectare of an oil palm plantation releases just over 21 tons of oxygen, and it absorbs nearly 30 tons of carbon dioxide in the process. By contrast, 1 hectare of soy only releases about 2.5 tons of oxygen and absorbs just 3.5 tons of carbon dioxide. In fact, in terms of how much carbon they capture per hectare per year, oil palms are comparable to rainforests. Another important factor to consider is that agricultural land is in limited supply. So when the world is looking at the vegetable oil business, the main focus should be on maintaining conservation and maximizing the yield per hectare. In this regard, the facts also look very promising for the oil palm industry. 1 hectare of oil palm currently produces around 4 tons of oil per year. However, oil palms are currently being modified and could end up yielding more than 3 times as much oil as they currently produce. If the research is conclusive, this could make their potential yield truly staggering.
You can't grow whatever crop you like at its optimum in any climate. Palm oil suits tropical climates.
So why should they grow jatropha when their land, which is scarce, can be used to grow oil palm or rubber and make a lot more money than growing jatropha?
A quick comparison shows that to produce as much oil from 1 hectare of palm, you would need 10 hectares of rapeseed or 15 hectares of soy. When lined up against other plants producing edible oils, nothing else even comes close to palm oil in terms of productivity. What does this kind of yield mean in practical terms? If 1 hectare of various oil-bearing crops were planted, and you then extract that oil and run a small passenger car with these different fuels, this is how far you'd get. Yield efficiency is becoming more important since the world population is growing continuously. In 1922, the Earth's population was about 2 billion people. By 2030, there may be as many as 8 billion people on the planet. As the human population increases and farming land becomes scarcer, the planet must find a way of producing 4 times as much food by then. In some parts of the world, the available agricultural land is already running out. And what makes this an even more pressing issue is that as people become more prosperous, their consumption of everything, including oils and fats, goes up. So when it comes to edible oils and fats production, then surely the world has to cultivate the crop with the highest carbon capture as well as the greatest yield. The oil palm industry has to immediately improve its environmental record and try to explain to its critics the benefits of palm oil, as well as listening to the negative arguments being directed back at them. Another area which needs rapid attention is proper and transparent regulation. In many people's eyes, the oil palm industry is simply not policed enough, and its environmental record is quite shocking. If the palm oil industry is to be taken seriously by the world, then this is what the critics say has to be done. Plantation companies and smallholders need to halt deforestation immediately, and they especially need to stop converting peat land into oil palm plantations. The industry needs to stop and penalize those companies that still practice open burning, and instead learn how to capture more carbon and sequester it. The oil palm industry also needs to establish better land use practices, like establishing wildlife corridors and protecting riverbanks. The industry has to be better regulated. Although it is a relatively new industry, now is the time for its members to truly respond to their critics, in words as well as actions. Palm oil must be produced sustainably and justly in order to be recognized and respected by importing countries, its industrial clients, NGOs, and the skeptical consumers. To achieve these goals, national policies must be established and effectively enforced to insist that the large and small producers only cultivate and use sustainably produced palm oil. Consumers can also play their part and demand that not only palm oil, but all agricultural commodities, which includes edible oils and fats, are certified properly and have been cultivated by sustainable means. Many NGOs as well as individual consumers have already begun exerting considerable pressure on multinationals such as Unilever, Procter & Gamble and Nestlé to only purchase and use palm oil that has been sustainably produced. This has been somewhat successful and has led to the establishment of the Round Table for Sustainable Palm Oil, or RSPO, in 2004. This body includes planters, NGOs, food manufacturers, as well as other industry representatives.
And really the crux of that is not to clear land that has high levels of conservation value, not to clear land that would have a major impact on those people who are currently living on that area, and not to have an impact on flora and fauna that's currently also there.
Oil palm is the only crop now having the process of certifying for sustainability under the RSPO. All the other oilseed crops are not capable of being certified for sustainability. So when the West are asking for sustainable palm oil, but at the same time they never ask soya and rapeseed imported from other countries to be certified sustainable.
Sustainable means for us is the no more deforestation and the no more peatland destruction. That's simple for the palm oil industry.
In order to make companies even more accountable, the Palm Oil Buyers Scorecard was introduced by the World Wildlife Fund, or WWF, in mid-2009 to help industrial buyers choose only sustainably produced palm oil. It is worth noting in its defense that at the moment, palm oil appears to be the only vegetable oil for which there is any sort of sustainability criteria at all. At the present time, only about 2 million tons of certified sustainable palm oil is produced worldwide, about half of which comes from Malaysia. It only costs $15 more per ton to purchase palm oil that has been certified as sustainable. And how much have these companies purchased so far? Only 2% of what is available, a pathetically low figure. Everyone is worked up about sustainability, and it has become a hot topic in society, sometimes even taken out of context. But when it actually comes to putting their money on the table, some of these multinational companies still prefer the slightly cheaper option. This is only the beginning, and there is now more dialogue between those for palm oil and those against it, but a lot more needs to be done. No one in their right mind wants to abolish palm oil entirely, as this would have grave ecological and economic consequences, as the world would have to move back to less efficient crops, and this would directly affect the rural poor who depend on palm oil for their livelihoods. The objective is to force all the industries involved in the production and the consumption of palm oil to do so in a sustainable and responsible manner. They also have to remember that the worldly consumer is now better educated and more aware of what they buy and what they eat. One thing is quite certain. The demand for vegetable oils will continue to rise, even though the planet cannot sustain more deforestation and the clearing of tropical rainforests across the biodiverse regions of the world. The planet is coming to a crossroads on many environmental and ecological issues, and palm oil is one industry that is currently in the spotlight. So there appears to be only two choices when looking at this industry. Either human beings radically change the way they live, or we produce enough to meet worldwide demand, but without more deforestation. Since people are pretty unlikely to change the way they live, the only way is to cultivate the most efficient crops possible. If this is the case, then could palm oil help to meet the world's demand for edible oils and fats, and also be considered as a potential source of renewable energy? Its critics maintain that palm oil is part of the problem, while its supporters claim that it's part of the solution.
The palm oil industry is important. Greenpeace itself, we are not saying we against palm oil. What we against is the deforestation, peatland destruction, environmental damage.
We can continue to be sustainable long after other crops are already non-sustainable or out of business. In other words, we are the last to go bankrupt.
But as a future, it's got three great opportunities. Number one, it's renewable. Number two, there's a great carbon capture mechanism. And number three, it gives a lot of opportunities for labour and for people to have a good livelihood out of it.
So I don't know how people think that we are not sustainable. In fact, we are, to me, the most sustainable business in the world.
Of course, I'm not saying that oil palm business, for example, is without sin. No, there are, and I mentioned that earlier. Not at all. We must work together so that at the end of the day, the world benefits because palm oil or oil palm is the most efficient vegetable oil producer.
If we cannot stop this kind of destruction, we will fail to save this planet.
The major issues confronting the palm oil industry, I think, is firstly the need to get buy-in from all stakeholders, particularly the growers, of the need to maintain sustainable operations. The second thing is to improve the communication of what palm oil is all about, the effects on the environment and the positive aspects of palm oil, particularly in the Western world, the end users, so they understand what palm oil is and the benefits of having palm oil, and the negatives and how those negatives are being addressed.